Dear friends, in the previous videos, I tried to show how we can understand the basic principles of the construction of the Egyptian pyramids by examining the patterns and features of their internal structure, and how important information is contained in the numerous strange details that we see inside and outside these ancient structures. In particular, I suggested that the inclined channels coming from the king's chamber and the queen's chamber in the Khufu pyramid were laid on top of the inclined ramps, since this is the only way to explain the fantastic precision of the angle with which they were built. And in the future, I will give many more arguments in favor of this version. But now let's try to understand what was the main purpose of these narrow shafts. After all, despite a large number of studies, the debate around this topic has not subsided to this day. It would seem that since these channels are only in the Khufu pyramid, the key to solving this mystery should also be sought in the Great Pyramid. But, as you will soon see, the search for an answer to this most important question will take us far beyond the Giza Plateau. As is known, there are two main versions of the purpose of these inclined shafts. The first is religious, according to which these inclined shafts look at certain stars. The second version is more rational and suggests that these shafts are ventilation channels. Many viewers in the comments to my previous videos also suggested the idea that ropes were pulled through them during construction. I am sure that is not the case. These shafts are too narrow for this. In addition, they have bends. This is especially true for the northern shafts, and the ropes would simply wear out at the bends, leaving traces on the limestone blocks. But we do not see any such traces inside the channels. However, despite the fact that I consider this assumption to be erroneous, I really like the approach to finding the answer. I also think that these channels were originally intended to be used during the construction process. But in what way exactly? To answer this difficult question, we need to take a closer look at one very interesting aspect of pyramid construction, the connecting thread that unites all these structures. At first, it may seem somewhat secondary to you, but as you will see later, it was this aspect that influenced many of the internal details of the pyramids, the purpose of which still causes heated debate among Egyptologists. But let's take everything in order. The pit in Zawiyat El Aryan. It is currently inaccessible because it is located on the territory of a military base. A large-scale study of this pit was conducted only once at the beginning of the 20th century. It was carried out by the Italian archaeologist Alessandro Barsanti. It took a huge amount of time and effort to excavate the filled-in pit, which he accidentally stumbled upon while walking through the desert. We will not dwell on all the numerous interesting details of these excavations now. I will only tell you about one seemingly minor episode. In March 1905, the pit was almost completely excavated. At its bottom, made of huge limestone and granite blocks, a strange sarcophagus with an oval lid was found. But at some point, the weather turned bad, and there was a heavy rain. The lower part of the pit was flooded. The water level reached 3 meters, but by midnight, the water level had dropped sharply to 1 meter. Thus, almost 400 cubic meters of water disappeared quite quickly, and the remaining 200 cubic meters were scooped out by several hundred people over the course of the next week. This gave Barsanti the idea that there might be a hidden room below, and he began to lift huge blocks of the floor one by one, trying to find it. As a result, nothing was found, although the blocks were dismantled to a depth of 5 meters. Of course, we will not try to find hidden rooms in the floor of the pit, but we'll look at this story rationally. If you create a pit in a rocky foundation 20 meters deep, then water will inevitably get into it. since it must have remained in the open air for at least several years during the construction of the pyramid, and in this period of time, heavy rainfalls could have occurred repeatedly. The ancient builders, who used the technology of pits many times, could not help but understand this, and were simply obliged to provide a reliable drainage system for the removal of rainwater. It is logical to assume that Alessandro Barsanti witnessed the work of this system. In the Abu Rawash pit, we can also find the remains of a similar system. Look, the so-called Robber's Tunnel is highlighted in color here. At the bottom of this tunnel, there is a shaft more than 3 meters deep cut into the rocky base. Why the robbers would need to cut a tunnel in the floor and then in the rock remains absolutely unclear. And I 100% agree with the assumption of Keith Hamilton, the author of an excellent series of books on the Egyptian pyramids, that these may be the remains of a drainage system. And if the robbers did most of the damage, they cut through the masonry along the drainage channel. And this example very clearly illustrates the basic principle of water drainage, which, in my opinion, was implemented by the builders in all pyramids. Such a system in any pyramid should always consist of two parts. The first part worked when the pit or construction site was open. It should be some kind of shaft in the rocky base, ending in a crack capable of draining a large amount of water. The second part should have been attached to the first during the creation of internal rooms and filling the pit with masonry so that water could drain from already finished or partially finished rooms. I believe that we see these two parts in the photo, and further in this video, we will pay attention primarily to such double systems. And what about the other pyramids? Let's try to assess how relevant the problem of water drainage was. According to research, the climate in ancient Egypt was slightly more humid than it is now, but still dry. On average, there was little precipitation. However, heavy downpours did occur. I have already given an example of a flooded pit in Zawiat El Aryan. Heavy rains occur today as well, and obviously, the ancient builders paid attention to this problem. Here is a drain in the Niuser pyramid. The drainage system was built into the basalt floor of the upper temple of Khufu. There are also drains in many later temples in Karnak, Abydos, and other places. And if the builders were concerned about drainage in these buildings, then it is logical to assume that they somehow solved this problem in the huge pyramids, the construction of which stretched out over many years and even decades. Let's look at the upper chamber of the Red Pyramid. The floor in it has been dismantled to a depth of more than 4 meters. It is not very clear who is the author of such destruction. It could have been done by the builders themselves or by robbers who came much later. But for us, something else is important. It is clearly visible how the ideal masonry of the walls goes down. We see a similar, almost ideal masonry in the vertical shafts of the upper system of the bent pyramid. In the connecting tunnel of the bent pyramid, the even masonry of blocks on mortar continues for about 7 meters. We see the same masonry in the Caviglia tunnel near the king's chamber in the Khufu pyramid. 6 meters of even masonry are also visible in the tunnel behind the niche in the queen's chamber. That is, everywhere around the chambers and corridors, in addition to the cladding blocks themselves, the precise joining of which everyone loves to talk about, we see multi-meter masonry of well-fitted blocks on mortar. It turns out that a strong multi-meter frame was created around the chambers and corridors, and then lower quality masonry was laid further on. But such a frame, in addition to being strong, is also hermetically sealed. And if it was somehow possible to scoop out water from an open pit, attracting a large number of workers, then extracting water from half-built internal rooms would have turned into an unsolvable task, given their enormous volume and the lack of convenient access to them. Therefore, the builders simply had to provide a reliable water drainage system for all internal rooms. Otherwise, these chambers would instantly turn into a pool during construction after the first rain. And in general, considering that the area of the construction site of each pyramid was at least several hectares, it is simply impossible to overestimate the importance of the drainage system in the process of erecting these structures. And understanding this obvious fact can radically change our understanding of the purpose of many parts located inside the pyramids. Let's return to the upper chamber of the Red Pyramid. Note that the blocks under the floor are processed much worse than the wall blocks. They are not even properly leveled. Perhaps the builders simply saved time and resources in this way, because these blocks did not bear any load and the quality of the masonry did not play any role here. But it can also be assumed that water could have gone down through them during the construction of the pyramid, because the final flooring was always installed at the end of the construction of the chamber. A serious argument in favor of such an assumption is seen in the satellite pyramid of the Bent Pyramid. In its only chamber, the smooth masonry of the walls also continues deep down. And most importantly, this pit goes below the surface level and the rock foundation is broken through below. But why? There is no visible reason for this. And again, we see signs of a double drainage system. Therefore, the only assumption that comes to my mind is outfall. That is, for chambers located not very high above the surface level, this method of water drainage could have been used. Now let's look at the drawings of the pyramids attributed to Pharaoh Snefru, Medum Pyramid. We see a vertical shaft at the bottom of the descending passage. There is a similar shaft in the upper system of the Bent Pyramid. In the lower system of this pyramid, at the bottom of the descending passage, there is a roughly cut hole. It is not marked on the drawings of Italian researchers Vito Maragioglio and Celeste Rinaldi, because at the time of their work, this place had not yet been cleared. But we know about it from an article by Charles Regano, published in 2002. There is a similar shaft in the Red Pyramid, and they are all located exactly where the water drainage is in the Abu Rawash pit, at the very bottom of the inclined corridors. Therefore, I think these shafts could also have been designed to drain water flowing down the ramp or the already built corridor. Perhaps some of them were covered with masonry after the construction was completed. Unfortunately, there is very little data on these niches. But that's not all. There is one very interesting element in the lower chamber of the Bent Pyramid. Egyptologists have jokingly called it the chimney. It is a vertical shaft 15 meters high, located next to the chamber. The only rational explanation that has been proposed so far is that this shaft was originally supposed to lead to the main chamber. But during construction, the plans changed and the shaft was abandoned. This idea was put forward by Franck Monnier and Alexander Puchkov. In their opinion, this is an unfinished analog of the vertical tunnel leading to the chamber of the Medum Pyramid. We will discuss how true this explanation may be a little later. But I think it is most logical to assume that this chimney was also part of the rainwater drainage system during the construction of the pyramid, because there is a deep vertical shaft near its lower end. Unfortunately, the records of Abdul Salam Hussein, who found this shaft in 1946, have been lost to this day, and there is no precise information about it. It is known that it was located under the flooring and was filled with blocks on mortar. From the story of the workers who participated in the excavations, we learn that as a result of the study, the shaft was dismantled to a depth of 8 meters. But whether the bottom of the shaft was reached is still unclear. After the excavations, the shaft was again filled with blocks, and no further research was carried out. You must agree that the presence of such a shaft is a serious argument in favor of the fact that water flowed down through this chimney, because we again see two tunnels nearby. One goes through the masonry, the other through the rock base. And in this video, we will return to this most interesting and unique element of the bent pyramid more than once, because, in my opinion, it is in it that the keys to unraveling many of the secrets of the Egyptian pyramids are hidden. Now let's try to understand how the problem of rainwater drainage was solved in the Khufu pyramid. The lowest point in it is an underground chamber. The Ancient Architects channel has recently released 2 detailed videos about this chamber. In one of them, the author makes an extremely logical assumption that this dead-end section of the tunnel is an element of the drainage system for water pouring from above along the descending corridor. This is very logical, because on the side plan, we see that this tunnel begins at the lowest point of the room. In addition, from the Edgar Brothers book Great Pyramid Passages, we know that it was quite comfortable to work in this tunnel. There was enough air for breathing and for burning candles for a long time. This is most likely explained by the presence of some kind of crack that allows both air and water to pass through. It is quite possible that this is the crack we see on a small bend in the corridor not far from its endpoint. But how did the water get into this corridor? It would seem that the answer is obvious. Water flowed down the ascending corridor, got into the descending corridor, and through it into the underground chamber. But as I assumed in the previous videos, the ascending corridor was blocked at the time of construction, and water could not flow through it. And if so, then the purpose of the so-called well shaft immediately becomes clear. At the moment, the most popular idea is that it was created for the exit of workers who installed granite plugs at the lower end of the ascending corridor. And I categorically do not like this idea. Firstly, because a much shorter and more convenient route could have been chosen for this. Secondly, this vertical tunnel is additionally reinforced at the junction of the masonry and the rock base. And this is absolutely pointless if it is intended only for a one-time movement of people. In addition, this means that this well shaft was in the construction plan from the very beginning. And again, we see 2 parts. The upper one passes through the masonry of the pyramid, the second one through the rocky base. So the idea that it was intended specifically to drain water seems to me the most rational. So, the water flowing onto the construction sites of the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber was diverted downwards through a vertical well shaft. But onto these sites themselves, the water flowed down ramps, the existence of which I previously assumed, and along which the inclined channels were laid. I think you understand what I'm getting at. When the ramps were open, there were no problems, and the water flowed down them. But at a certain point, the builders had to fill them with blocks. And the problem of water drainage became relevant again. I believe that the inclined shafts were laid precisely to solve this problem. It was through them that the water flowed first into the chambers themselves and then further down. Pay attention to how they are laid. Most of them are made of blocks that form a square pipe without a lower edge. That is, they were not on the open ramps. They were created precisely at the moment of filling the ramps with blocks, in the same way as the main corridors were created. And this, as I see it, is where the answer lies. These channels were created because there are no corridors on these ramps. In all the other pyramids, there are corridors on the ramps, and in addition to their main functions, they also perform the function of draining water downwards. But here, they were not, so the builders decided to lay inclined channels to drain the water. And notice how this single water drainage system works. It would seem that it is possible to divert water vertically downwards or to the side faces of the pyramid. But then it would be necessary to build a new system for each stage of construction. But the builders acted much more rationally. They used a single system, which included the main corridors, and each time they added a new segment to it from above, thus avoiding both unnecessary labor costs and unnecessary holes in the masonry. Of course, a number of important questions immediately arise. For example, why are these shafts so narrow? Why can a person crawl through the well shaft of the Khufu pyramid and the chimney in the lower chamber of the bent pyramid, while the width of these shafts barely exceeds 20 centimeters? And why were the lower shafts never brought to the Queen's chamber? After all, we know that the limestone casing blocks were only broken through by Wayneman-Dixon in 1872. And before that, the channels were not connected to the chamber. Well, now we will try to find answers to these key questions. Where do you think we will start our search? Yes, in the chimney of the bent pyramid. There are a couple of very interesting details in this chimney, which I have already talked about a little. These are two niches in which blocks are vertically positioned. Now they are fixed with mortar, but it is obvious that they could have only one purpose. They were supposed to cover the vertical tunnel. I think that is why the idea appeared that initially this chimney was supposed to lead to the main chamber. That is, these blocks, according to Frank Monnier and Alexander Puchkov, are portcullises. There is certainly some logic in this, but this assumption is shattered by one important fact. The thing is, a window was made above the lower entrance to this chimney, and this window is located right above the first locking block. Accordingly, using this block as a portcullis is absolutely pointless. It can simply be bypassed. In addition, it is completely unclear why this window was made at all. It would only help potential robbers to get up. It is believed that this element could have served as a relief for the lower approach to the chimney. But, firstly, this passage is even narrower than the main corridors, and it is not clear at all why it had to be relieved. And secondly, if such a task was set, then why couldn't a false vault be made right above this passage? Right opposite it, we see an antechamber, made in exactly this way. Agree, this all looks very strange. It turns out to be an absolutely paradoxical situation. On the one hand, we have locking blocks, and on the other hand, these blocks definitely could not serve as portcullises. Moreover, for some reason there are two of these blocks, and for some reason they were not lowered down, closing the chimney, but instead were fixed with mortar in a vertical position. What does all this mean? I'll be honest, I spent a lot of time trying to answer this question. But now that I think the answer has been found, I'm sure it was worth the time. Because the answer I found confirms many of the assumptions I made in this and previous videos. So, let's go back to the Khufu pyramid for a moment. At the end of the lower inclined channels that do not reach the surface of the pyramid, robots found blocks with handles. I think everyone who is even slightly interested in Egyptian pyramids has seen these photos. Moreover, these blocks are intermediate plugs, which were most likely gradually moved as the shafts were being created, because when one of them was drilled, an empty space was discovered behind it. Why could they have been needed? The answer is most likely very simple. The construction of the pyramid involved a huge amount of stone processing work, which was carried out at the top when the blocks were joined. There must have been a lot of garbage and stone fragments, and even a small amount of them could have clogged the narrow inclined shafts. Accordingly, it is quite logical that the builders closed them with valves. This assumption is expressed in the article of the Isida project, and I completely agree with it. But the builders of the bent pyramid faced the same problem. Note how the lower shaft is shifted relative to the chimney. Why could this have been done? I believe that this is a simple safety system. If a block falls down during construction, then with this arrangement of the shaft, it will fly down several meters. And if the shaft was located directly under the chimney, it would fly down more than 10 meters and smash the entire drain. And in general, climbing to the bottom of an 8-meter shaft every time to remove construction debris from there is not much fun. Therefore, the location of this lower shaft looks very reasonable. But the height of this chimney is more than 15 meters, and as it was being built, this problem became relevant again. And I think that these locking stones were created precisely to solve it. That is, they are the same plugs as the blocks with handles in the Khufu pyramid, only much larger. And pay attention to their size. They are as tall as a person. If such a stone falls sideways, there is a high probability that it will not block the shaft, but simply split. So they were clearly not intended to fall. On the contrary, they were intended to be lifted. Initially, they were in a horizontal position, and the garbage accumulated on top. And this window was intended to remove it. That is why it is located slightly above the block. And after the next block was installed, this block was lifted and placed vertically. And so that it did not accidentally fall, it was fixed with mortar. That is why we now see these blocks in this position. They are raised and glued to the niches with mortar. Moreover, the number and location of these blocks is not accidental either. Look, the lower chamber of the bent pyramid is built in a pit. No researcher of the bent pyramid argues with this statement. And as I previously suggested, such pits were filled in stages. Traces of these stages are visible in Abu Rawash. And, I am sure, the location of these locking blocks in the chimney of the bent pyramid coincides with these stages. As we know, the floor in this lower chamber was raised and a staircase was made to the upper platform. This entire structure was assembled from small rectangular blocks, and, you must admit, it is very similar to what we now see in the upper chamber. The same superstructure, the same blocks. So pay attention that this platform exactly matches the level of the window leading to the chimney. Moreover, the level of the platform also exactly matches the upper level of the antechamber. If the creation of the antechamber corresponded to one of the stages of filling the pit with blocks, which is very logical, then the platform with the window and the first locking block, located at the same level, also corresponded to this stage. Now let's continue the line of the stairs further. Everyone notes that it goes right to the connecting tunnel, but in fact it ends up one step of the false vault lower. And exactly at this level is the upper locking block. That is, most likely, the next stage of the chamber's construction ended at this level. And this coincidence of the levels of these locking stones with the stages of construction may be very important for us. Let's move back to the Khufu pyramid. It's time to take a closer look inside the inclined shafts. I will use the information obtained by Rudolf Gantenbrink and present it on the website of the excellent Isida project. They collected all the anomalies and interesting details that can be seen in the pictures and videos taken by the Upuaut robot inside the inclined channels. We are interested in two types of such details. First, the not fully processed blocks. I will mark their position on the diagram. In the upper southern shaft, block number 5 is not finished at all, and its ceiling covers half of the corridor. In the lower southern shaft, block number 8 is very poorly processed, and block number 9 is half unprocessed. In the upper northern shaft, the ceiling is unfinished on blocks 23 and 24. Unfortunately, Gantenbrink's robot could not get into the lower northern shaft because of a sharp turn, and it is difficult to draw any conclusions from the photographs obtained by another robot, since they do not give a complete picture of the state of the shaft. Therefore, we will not consider the lower northern shaft now. As you can see, there are quite a lot of unfinished blocks. How can this be explained? The authors of the study suggest that a separate team of builders was involved in laying these channels, and they did not have time to complete their work since the level of the pyramid was rising too quickly. I simply could not help but quote this. Of course, with all due respect, this idea only makes one smile. Each row of pyramid blocks had to be laid for at least several weeks, and if the inclined shafts were created together with the main masonry, the workers had plenty of time. But the fact remains that there are unfinished blocks, and this requires some kind of rational explanation. Now, the second type of details. We are interested in traces of the inclined shafts being blocked. In the upper southern shaft, not far from the surface of the pyramid, there is a small but interesting element. This is an extension with additional notches. Judging by the width of this groove, which is 8 centimeters, there should have been exactly the same locking door here as at the end of the lower shafts. The thickness of the drilled Gantenbrink door is exactly 8 centimeters. That is, this is a socket for the locking block, and it has an extension in order to turn this block and insert it into place. On the north side, the upper channel at this level is almost completely destroyed. Researchers claim that one of the walls of the channel has been preserved, and there are no such grooves on it, but I would not make categorical conclusions. Let's leave the possibility of the presence of such an element here under question. In addition, inside the lower southern shaft, there are traces of mortar on a couple of blocks. The Isida Project article suggests that these traces correspond to intermediate positions of the locking block inside the shaft, and between these positions, it was moved using copper lugs, the ends of which we see on the other side of the block. Well, you must admit, it sounds extremely logical. Now let's ask two very important questions that the authors of the Isida Project failed to ask. First, why were the locking blocks fixed in these specific positions? And second, how could such a plug move in those places of the shafts where the blocks were unfinished? The answer to the last question is very simple. No way. This plug could not move there in principle. How should this be understood then? If my assumptions are correct, then this socket for the locking block in the upper southern shaft is a direct analog of the niches in the chimney of the bent pyramid. And if so, then this element and the fixing points of the plug in the lower southern shaft should coincide with the stages of construction. And this is very easy to check. Let's just turn on the block row height map. As you can see, all 3 points perfectly match the level of the rows that have a greater height. But why are these points located only here and not below? Perhaps you already guess. All these oddities, in my opinion, can be explained very simply. I think the inclined shafts were not built gradually, along with the general level of the pyramid's masonry. They were laid in sections along the inclined ramps when they were filled with blocks. That is why the builders were in a hurry. The lower southern shaft was immediately brought to at least this point, that is, to the floor level of the king's chamber. Here we see the lateral displacement of the blocks. And only after this point, most likely, it was built gradually along with the general level of masonry. It is from this point that the processing of the blocks becomes much better. And this is logical because there was already enough time to process the blocks in this area. Starting from block 19, scratches appear on the side walls of the shaft, and they go to block 26. That is, the plug was inserted somewhere here and gradually moved to the second fixation point. And the upper shafts, judging by everything, were laid in one stage, almost their entire length at once. At the same time, the builders really could have missed the deadlines, and that is why the blocks are unfinished in the upper part. And there is one more argument in favor of this assumption. Let's turn on the height map of the rows once again. Note that the unfinished blocks fall exactly on the high rows. What could be the reason for such a coincidence? Again, I think there is no mysticism here either. The fact is that these blocks are simply longer than the blocks located next to them. That is, the builders used longer blocks to create inclined shafts in those places where the rows of the main masonry are higher. Here in the upper northern shaft, we see the longest block of all. Its length is 4 meters, and it is unfinished. And if the inclined shafts were built gradually, there would have been enough time for processing, and problems would not have arisen. But since an entire segment was created at once, many blocks were processed at the same time. And it is very logical that the builders simply did not have time to finish the longest of them, and they were inserted slightly unfinished. Perhaps it is in this layout of these shafts that the answers to the questions asked earlier are hidden. These inclined shafts are so narrow because they were intended to drain water from fairly localized areas of construction, namely from ramps filled with blocks. And, most importantly, the range of time of their possible operation was very limited, because the ramps were filled not gradually along with the increase in the level of the main masonry, but in large sections at once. Perhaps this is why the lower shafts were never put into operation. Heavy rains fell rarely, and during the period of time when the ramps were filled with blocks, there simply were none. Of course, there are other questions. For example, why did the builders need to place the outlets of these channels in the chambers directly opposite each other? If in the Queen's chamber this can be explained by the geometry of the ramps, then in the King's chamber this argument does not work for the northern shaft, since it immediately goes off to the side. At the moment, I do not have an answer to this question. Perhaps this fact is no longer really connected with the construction process and was determined by some other considerations. At the same time, the builders could have left the upper shafts as ventilation ducts after the pyramid had been erected. Why close them if they were already built? But the version that ventilation was the main purpose of these inclined shafts, I consider extremely unlikely, despite the fact that it is promoted by such well-known YouTube channels as History for Granite and Ancient Architects. The main drawback of this version is the absence of similar channels in other pyramids. If such ventilation were required in the chambers, it would not only be here. Was it really only in this pyramid that rituals after the burial of the pharaoh were performed? In my opinion, this sounds very unconvincing. Also, look at how the builders tried to maintain the angle of the shafts throughout their entire length. Yes, I'm sure this is because they were laid on top of inclined ramps. But at the beginning of the channels, there were no ramps. And the bend of the lower northern shaft could have been made much simpler than it actually was. It is obvious that the builders tried to keep the channel at an angle all the time, which is pointless for ventilation. But for the drain, it is simply necessary. Otherwise, you will immediately get a potential blockage, which is very critical for such narrow channels. And of course, after the construction was completed, hundreds of religious purposes could have been thought up for these inclined shafts. After all, if modern Egyptologists could do this, then why couldn't the ancient Egyptian priests have thought of it before? I would also like to note that the existence of such inclined ramps, along which inclined shafts were stretched, is a very significant argument in favor of my assumption that the chambers located above the ground level were also built in improvised pits created directly in the masonry of the pyramids. That is, I believe that the builders reproduced the shape of the pits that we see in Abu Rawash and Zawiyat El Aryan, but already directly in the masonry of the blocks. And the presence of inclined shafts in the Khufu pyramid is a direct consequence of this construction technology. And finally, for the sake of completeness, I would like to show you two more elements of the internal structure of the Khufu pyramid, which, in my opinion, are also quite likely related to the water drainage system. First of all, this is the tunnel in the niche of the Queen's chamber, which I have already mentioned. Now it is significantly raised relative to the floor level, but it is necessary to take into account the fact that the floor blocks in the Queen's chamber are missing. The first 6 meters of this tunnel go through fairly even masonry, consisting of well-processed blocks on mortar, and then much less neat masonry begins. That is, we again see a double system. It is quite possible that this distant section of the tunnel was created first, and when the pit around the chamber was filled with blocks, a flat section was added to it. And only after the end of construction was the tunnel closed with a block in the back wall of the niche. And there is another interesting nuance. In the descending corridor, already in the part that goes through the rocky base, there is an insert made of limestone blocks. How these blocks could have been dragged through a narrow corridor 1 meter wide and installed in place is absolutely beyond me. In my opinion, there can only be one explanation for this fact. The rock in this place was broken through from above, and the blocks were fed from there. That is, most likely, this is a vertical tunnel leading to the descending corridor. If so, then it could not have had any other function except for draining water. At least, nothing else comes to mind. At the same time, please note that this insert is located almost next to the projection of the fourth girdle stone. And let's say it carefully, the presence of a water drain here clearly indicates that there was something above from which this water had to be drained. Let's sum it up. One idea about the need to drain rainwater during construction can explain many strange facts and connect many details of the pyramids, the functionality of which remains a mystery to this day. And most importantly, this idea is rational. It can be analyzed, unlike numerous attempts to attribute a mystical or religious meaning to any incomprehensible thing. Of course, you can object to this by saying that it is somewhat incorrect to declare every hole in the floor a drain. I agree with you, but if there are no other reasonable explanations for this hole, then the drainage system version is at least worth considering. All this, of course, requires much more careful study. After all, many of the listed details were studied a long time ago, and we can judge them only by scanty descriptions or photographs of very poor quality. And of course, ideally, it would be necessary to test this hypothesis in practice. In some cases, a couple of buckets of water could be enough for this. But as you understand, the current policy of the Egyptian authorities in the field of studying the pyramids does not allow us to even dream about this. Fortunately, even the information we have actually allows us to learn a lot about the process of building the pyramids. And in the following videos, we will definitely continue our fascinating journey into the times of the construction of these grandiose structures. Write in the comments what you think about the ideas presented in this video. And of course, if you liked the video, click like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much for your time and attention.